Hello, everyone.
Hello, hello. Welcome to our 24th edition of the Community Q&A, and this is actually our time zone edition.
24B.
24B. That's 2 years, by the way.
Yes,
Oh,
2
man.
years. 2 years.
To think of it like that,
Yeah.
it's something else. But
So it is.
Yes.
anyway, welcome. Mark, you want to?
Yeah, and well, as always, if you're new or a regular at this, the way this works is we have people in the room. I'm Mark Fussell, and we have Matt and Sharon over here, and Mark. We just sit here, and you just ask us any question that you want. So if you're new, you can either post it in the message window, you can either go onto audio if you want to speak to us that way, and you can ask us anything that you want. As long as we're just not forced to talk about under NDA stuff, but by now, given that we had a build conference recently, and in fact this morning we've put up a link to the build talk, which I will find.
No, you talk, I'll find.
And let's find that and post that up. It's worth spending time on a build talk that we gave at Service Fabric at Build that covered a new version of Service Fabric that we're releasing called Service Fabric Mesh, which is a purely serverless version of Service Fabric, so you don't manage clusters, you just have all the joy and happiness of deploying applications. So listen to that talk, because I think that answers a lot of questions, not only about what Service Fabric is doing in terms of a new hosted offering, but also it talks a lot bit about the overall direction of where we're taking Service Fabric, which is focusing around you building polyglot services with a communication intelligent communication between them all, and in particular things like reliable collections being disconnected from the actual underlying host themselves, the cluster of things. So listen to that, and then if you do go through the build talks, the other fun talk to watch was Mark Rozanovich's talk, where he talked on his talk called Mark Rozanovich and Data Center Futures. And around about minute 40, 43 inside there, he does 2 Service Fabric demos. One on Service Fabric Mesh, where you first watch him reboot his machine, and the second one where he shows Service Fabric running on the edge.
Yeah, Whit beat you to it.
Yeah, he did. Well, he's the one that provided this morning, believe it or not.
Okay. All right. Yes, there you go.
So
and there's Mark's.
and there's
Okay, well,
all right, what will we do without you?
we'll just sign off, and we'll be handling the rest of the Q&A.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. So that's perfect. So Mark's talk was a fun demo scenario around Die Hard.
Yeah. I think it was great.
So, all right. So, Marty's back. Gosh, good to see
can't
you,
get enough.
Marty. You can't get enough. So then,
Fire away with questions and
Sure.
let us know. So the first one. I think at this point, so the question is when is the new mesh stuff going to actually be made available? At this point, we're still in the kind of semi-private public preview where you can join.
You can join. We're not public. So
Right. Yeah. I understand.
maybe say private plus.
Yeah. Right. So people can get a hold of the stuff. You have to get through the sign-up process, and
Yes.
there have to be capacity and things like that. I don't know that we have a specific date yet. We're going to look at how much capacity we can get, feedback from the preview so far, address some of that stuff. I know we'll be reevaluating this in probably a couple
yeah,
weeks.
I mean, it's in the weeks, right? It's in the weeks.
Well, in a couple weeks, we'll be figuring out when the date's going to actually
Yeah,
Yes.
but it is closer rather than further out.
Yeah.
Put it that way. Most of it is because we had a lot of people sign up with capacity constraints around some of these things. We also had bugs, of course, and things like this.
Sure.
And it won't be long, but it's measured in weeks rather than months.
I think we really want to make sure that before we, fully open the floodgates, that the quality is high, that people will be able to be productive, and you won't be waiting for us to get the tools ready, which is I know one of the things that's missing so far. So today, if we let you in, you'd be able to read some cool docs,
Right.
But there wouldn't be really much to do. There wouldn't be an environment for you to play with. There wouldn't be a lot of great tools that you could actually use on your machine. So things like that we're working out.
However, if you are interested, because you're part of our community Q&A this afternoon, I'll be generous and we'll let you in.
Yeah, I think we'll
Yes.
let Mark Robinson
I'll-
will.
So if you got the URL,
I'll put a link in there.
if you do aka.ms/sf private preview.
SF Mesh Preview.
SF Mesh
I was
preview.
going to say, you
SF
did
Mesh
pretty
preview.
good though.
SF Mesh preview.
Yeah.
As opposed to, I mean, given that there's a relatively, there's only going to be 30 or 40 of you on here. We'll sign you all up and put you in this way.
Yeah.
So it's no problem. Just sign up.
I got it in my quick launch. So
You
I'm
did
easy.
good.
Yes.
That's perfect.
But yeah, I would say sign up. We'll let you in as soon as we can, as soon as there's good stuff to play with, and
Yes.
we'll get you at least whitelisted so you can get on the docs and stuff like that.
And get into we'll let you into our private GitHub repo, and you can read our docs there. That's Matt said.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Okay, next question.
Given all the differences between mesh and traditional classic cluster, is there any documentation detailing what they are? So I think there is stuff in the docs, but one thing that we want to make sure people understand is that there's not really intended to be any major differences between the environments. All of the features of each, they overlap. What mesh is really is the serverless environment. So there are some things in the mesh environment that you're not going to be able to carry over from today's clusters. So for example, there's APIs if you're running in a Service Fabric cluster today that let you reboot individual nodes or let you see all the services that are running in the cluster. Those can't carry over to mesh because mesh is a multi-tenant environment. So there's certain things that you can just do today that you can't do in mesh. But in terms of the capabilities, like the new YAML descriptions of your applications, the routing so that you don't have to write your own gateways. We do want remoting to work in mesh eventually. Partitioning, the auto scale stuff, all of that stuff is going to be present in Service Fabric proper. So they're really intended to be almost exactly the same in terms of capabilities where that makes sense and where we can offer the normal Service Fabric capabilities in the shared environment. Right? I mean, that's the whole point.
Yeah, exactly. That's the whole point. So, I mean, there's another question here is, will all of if you look at what we've effectively done in the current application manifest model, you actually have access to every single capability that you can imagine in terms of the actual environment itself. And also you'll see that we actually end up having this application manifest and we have this service manifest, but they describe and so first you can access things like the cluster properties inside there, you can do things inside there. So the first thing is just a simplification away from that, where it's just about applications. The other one was, and so you should just treat this as another, in the same way that we did compose as a format to see all that, think of this as a simplification that just looks at the app level. And in doing so, we also thought that it would be useful to separate out the resources. So if you look at like a service manifest today, it describes a network resource inside it, an endpoint, things like this.
I've got my certs in there, I've got endpoints, I've got my code, I've got config, and routes are kind of like left up to you, and it's very convoluted. There's a lot all in one place.
Yeah, and we found that actually with a lot of team development, that it was much more approachable to have those separated out. So you could create a network resource independent to a secret resource, independent to a service or an application, and then put them all together as one deployment.
So I think part of the other thing is that
actually we found to be very
useful.
Yeah.
I think part of the thing is that you're definitely seeing a point in time thing where we wanted to start talking about mesh so people knew what we were working on. We wanted to get people into the preview.
Yes.
But there are just certain things that we haven't been able to make work yet that it's just a point in time thing.
Yes.
So like remoting should eventually work inside of mesh, but today the way that remoting works is that it depends like on having this direct main line to naming, and for naming to be able to show you everything in the cluster, right? And that doesn't make any sense in the mesh environment. So the communication part, the direct, I have an IP of another service that I want to talk to, that part's fine, right? That part would work fine today. It's the discovery part that we need to figure out how to make that work in a multi-tenant way so that I can see my services in mesh, but I can't see Mark's services in mesh unless he's let me.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of stuff that yeah, it looks like the environments are more different today than they are going to be in the future.
Yeah.
Right. So
there's this question: is the private preview for Azure only, or does it include on premises?
It's Azure only.
It's Azure only.
It's Azure.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Because mesh is Azure.
Right. Mesh is the serverless environment in Azure. But the features, if you wait a couple Service Fabric mainline releases, all those features and capabilities are going to show up in regular Service Fabric. You could deploy them on-prem, and you would have, if you look inside the API today, you'll see, for example, the auto-scale stuff, right?
Yes.
That's in there.
And the volume drivers is a good one. So we actually shipped an Azure file volume driver.
Right.
And right now we've actually updated the existing XML manifest and put it in the docs inside there, or posted all, so you can use this volume driver from there. It just
Right.
happens to also be a volume driver resource type.
Right.
You'll have inside that model. And so it'll be in both. So you'll see both models always have same feature sets across
Yeah,
them.
as much as it makes sense. Again, I don't know that we're ever going to have a reboot my node in Mesh, because in Mesh you don't see nodes.
Yes.
Right. So things like that are the only things that we can think of that are not expected to transition into the Mesh environment. That does mean that like your code might not be able to move one-to-one from the cluster into Mesh, because you might be using APIs that there's just not going to be a corollary for them. And then we have to figure out how to manage that, right? Do we run some tool that tells you what you can bind against, or is it different APIs or something like this?
And if anything, we really want you to help us guide us on what we're going to do with some of this journey.
Right.
One of the questions is, what's the differences? Well, we don't know everything yet, actually.
Yeah, it's expected to be minimal, but we don't know yet.
Yeah.
So here's the question. Do we plan to document those differences?
Oh,
Yeah, of course.
Okay,
yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
So I think that's a good thing. too.
Now it'll be a choose your own adventure
Yeah, yeah.
novel. You just have to figure it out. No, yeah, of
Right.
course we're going to have to describe what will work in what environment and what won't work.
Absolutely.
The idea is
But-
that the majority of features
Yes.
work in both places.
Yes, the majority of
Right.
features now.
Mesh is primarily about a serverless, clusterless environment where you get to run your Service Fabric applications and you get all the same features and functionality, but you don't have to run the cluster, right? That's what we're taking
Yeah.
and doing ourselves for you, and you just get the environment that you can target.
And the vast majority of our support calls that we get through our customer support services are about cluster management. And so I think to a large degree, for those people who don't want to manage their clusters, this
Yeah.
is what it addresses for them.
I have a feeling we'll be talking more about Mesh throughout the call, so we can
Yes,
have
okay,
a couple
yeah,
more of these
okay,
questions,
let's keep going.
but
Okay.
I hope that kind of makes things clear.
Right.
Before we go,
Sure.
Matt, I want you to get this question, but from Mahmoud, I want to give a shout out to you. So Mahmoud actually joined us at our Build Happy Hour that we had for advisors.
Oh, great.
Yeah, so welcome. I'm glad you
Welcome.
joined our
Yeah.
Q&A.
Welcome to the community call.
Absolutely.
So the question is, can the on-prem version of Service Fabric manage VMs? Somebody's using VMware and it's got a SAN and all that stuff. So keep in mind, right, Service Fabric is really an application level platform. So you could certainly write a service that would run inside Service Fabric that would manage VMs, but Service Fabric itself doesn't manage VMs. We're built on top of the VMs. So on-prem, you'd be looking for something more like System Center Virtual Machine Manager would be, or something on-prem or Bosch. That's what would help you manage VMs, right? Service Fabric is just an environment, so we'd be on top of machines. So we could run that service that manages VMs, but we don't manage VMs ourselves. Just like in Azure, we don't manage VMs.
No, you could, of course, use Service Fabric to build a VM management system.
Right.
If you wanted to.
If you wanted to, if you think that that's a cool area for your hip startup.
Yes.
But we don't do that on our own. We rely on something else to provide the compute infrastructure to Service Fabric.
Yes.
Um,
So, answering your question on VMware.
Yeah, so sadly, no.
So sadly, no. But you can deploy it. We do have a lot of people who do deploy Service Fabric into VMware environments. And so they get VMs provisioned for them and then deploy Service Fabric across those. Just be aware, though, that if you start using SANs or other forms of HA around all those, it's advisable not. A SAN and a Service Fabric don't necessarily play particularly well together.
Yeah. So Marcin had a question around like decoupling the collections. The idea is that they stay basically as close to your code as they do today. There might be scenarios where, depending on exactly how you've set up, they move to a different proc that's co-located and maybe sharing memory with your proc. They might move to another machine, but we're really trying to get all the combinations done. The primary goal is to make sure that they're a library that you can include in any application, rather than something where you have to bind against a particular programming framework or model in order to get access to them. That's the main thing that we're trying to solve. So by default, they'll probably end up being still in the same process. There might be some scenarios where, depending on exactly how you've chosen to use them, they end up as a co-located separate process, but they'll still be pretty close. It's not like they're moving to a completely different machine by default or anything like that. So by default, not much.
So this is
overhead.
again, it's a future direction that we're just talking about. We're making sure that reliable collections are effectively independent of having you to bind to Service Fabric base class libraries.
Yeah, and it's worth mentioning that that's going to be a choice, right?
Yes.
The reliable services model that We ship today.
Yeah.
We're going to keep shipping.
Yeah, we're
Right.
gonna keep shipping.
And so if you're scared by whatever change it is that's coming in the new programming model kind of a way of doing things, you don't have to pick it up. You don't have to use it. You can continue to use the existing one. That might preclude you from running in, say, a mesh environment, but we're not going to break or take anything away. That's absolutely not the plan. So a question from Mark. See if I can read this here. Oh, okay. Question on Compose support. Yeah, Compose itself is still in preview. In our docs somewhere you can find there's a list of the tags that we actually support or the directives that we support.
It's in the Compose doc itself.
Well, the question is Compose file still is she's trying to use
Right.
volumes.
So, volumes work, but the format's a little weird. And then the networking support only supports, as he says here, NAT and Open. So overlay isn't there yet. So I think if you're trying to bring a Compose file in, just go and look at the Compose doc that we have. It'll tell you which tags we actually support, and that helps you know what you can expect. We are trying to finish out Compose support. We got a little bit delayed by doing all the mesh work, but that is something that we want to continue to provide support for.
Yeah, I mean, the overlay network is closer to our isolated, I believe, doesn't it? That's where all the services run inside their own individual network.
Private, yeah.
And that's a feature that's actually coming now in the 6.3 release, where you can say, here's a set of containers, and they all get deployed inside your own isolated network, because we built that effectively for mesh, and then you're going to get that in the rest of the system.
Right.
So what we'll make sure then inside Compose is you can actually then choose the overlay option there, which will actually just turn on the isolated network option, and you can get it there. So effectively, that's exactly what you'll see. You'll see in the resource model that we have that applies across all our versions of Service Fabric. You'll be able to use isolated network. You'll be able to do isolated network in existing XML manifest model, and then you'll be able to specify overlay inside Compose. They all achieve the same thing. So that's a good example, actually.
Jacob asks, is there schema posted for the Service Fabric VM extension? I don't actually think it is. Most of what's in that schema is really just Service Fabric cluster configuration, and that is described. But the extension has some other things additionally, which I don't think we described. It should be able, you should be able to query ARM and see a schema. So like if you go to resources.azure.com and go to the cluster resource or go to the VMSS resource and look at the extensions there, you can find it. But I know that we had a bug where we hadn't actually published the official schema of our extension specifically. And I don't know whether or not we've resolved that, frankly. So maybe that's something we take as a improvement. We can give that to Alex and say, hey, let's help figure this out.
Yeah, that's good. But again, GitHub issues is a great place to raise questions like this, and then we fix them.
Yeah.
So let's get that raised.
Is that 100%?
We get through them as fast as we possibly can, given the rate they come in at.
Right.
There's a ton of issues.
Large community, small number of us. We do our best. Thank you for your patience in advance. But yeah, the GitHub issues list is good if you find this type of stuff where the docs are just missing. That helps us track these issues so we don't lose them. And that way we can have a conversation to make sure that, once we publish it, that it matches your expectation and that sort of thing.
Does the Azure file volume, does the SF Azure files volume use the CFS driver on Linux? I'm asking because its CFS driver is pretty limited. It's not POSIX compliant. Well, I don't know what they use at the back end of Azure files storage. So,
yeah, I haven't checked. I honestly don't know.
So I don't know how to answer that question.
Manny would probably be best, or?
Yeah, it's probably Gaurav, actually.
Gaurav?
Yes.
Yeah, I asked them just now.
Okay.
We'll get back to you.
We'll see if you
But
reply.
this is on file. This is Azure file storage. Yes, so we're just calling their implementation of whether they do it to create a file.
Abhishek just responded and he said yes.
So it is CFS.
Yeah, the Azure files does use the CIFS driver on Linux.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Cool.
Good, not so good though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
But there you go.
Good but limited.
Good but limited. Will SF Mesh support private VNets out of the box? Yes, it will, as will Service Fabric proper. So the goal is that from now on, when you create application instances, there are all the services inside of that application instance, whether that's a application resource described in the resource model in Mesh, or when you take that same model and deploy it to a regular cluster, or if you're using today's application model on a cluster, the idea is that you'll be able to say, hey, put everything inside this application in a private VNet by default. So.
Yeah, and then adding to that as well is that there's going to be the ability to bring your own VNet to a service fabric application that you've deployed, certainly inside mesh. So you can then say, I already have my database deployed inside this VNet, and I want to attach this VNet and make sure when I deploy this application instance. So that's waiting on work that we're having to get done by the Azure networking guys. You'll see a similar related thing with Azure container instances, where an Azure container instance can't bring their own VNet today. So several teams are sort of waiting on the capability of being able to bring that sort of thing. So that's another future thing that we get asked quite a lot, because it's very important for you to be able to deploy an application and hook up to existing resources that you have through VNet.
Okay. What's next?
Marcin, are you still planning reliable collections shims?
I don't remember what the shims were. What were the shims?
The reliable collection shims, I think, was what Manny talked about at Ignite last year, which were shims. If you were using MongoDB or something like that, you could lift and shift that and then use the reliable collections Mongo shim to convert all of those to using reliable collections underneath the hood.
No, I don't think it's. But anyway,
yeah,
those things.
Marcin just said exactly. So
okay,
yeah, and the answer is that is still in the timeline, but we don't know when it's gonna come. We need to put the volumes up.
Okay. Well, what's next?
Geo redundancy options be available for mesh across available zones and potential regions. We should talk about just availability zones generally first.
Yeah, I mean, if AZs, absolutely. We want you, when you deploy into the mesh environment, to be able to say what level of distribution you want to target. So AZs is absolutely on the map. We will probably get to Geo eventually. I don't know exactly when. We need a couple additional features and to light things up there in parts of Azure. You can, of course, build a geographic cluster today. It's hard and probably pretty expensive. But yeah, we'll start with AZs. That's a pretty good start. And then you can, if you can put your backups in something like Azure Blob Storage or Cosmos and replicate that across site. That works pretty well to give you, some sort of backup and safety should a particular region fail. Okay.
Okay, let me see. So Mahmoud has a, thanks for your answer. We're looking to provide a low barrier way for organizations that have already sunk a lot of money into their infrastructures to start modernizing their apps and don't want to pay for that hybrid phase where their support on-prem and Azure. I think it was that Service Fabric on-prem would provide them the capability to modernize their apps and provide them a single pane of glass view into their environment. Second part of that question focuses on connecting Service Fabric on-prem to Azure. Can services and or apps running on-prem Service Fabric move to Azure?
Sure.
Well, yeah, I think part of the goal here is that maybe, was this a follow-on from the VM question?
Yes, it was.
Oh, okay. We do see a lot of people who use Service Fabric to deploy and create their own on-premise clusters. And then you just effectively treat it as just another environment that you deploy things into. So using it from that regard, where you already have some infrastructure that you want to use, you can set up a 5-machine cluster, hook them together with a network, run a single PowerShell command that set up your Service Fabric cluster in about a minute. One thing that we're trying to make sure that makes that life easier for you there, how to set it up, that we're working our way towards, is also having it so you can actually post a manifest description, actually I should say a JSON description, into Azure itself, and ask Azure to download all the packages onto the set of machines that you want to do, and then deploy it across all those, rather than you having to hunt around for the package.
Yeah, this was kind of the edge demo that I think we mentioned in earlier about Mark Rusinovich showed, where you have a bunch of machines on-prem and you want them, to become a Service Fabric cluster, but you don't want to necessarily have to deal with deploying and managing Service Fabric onto those machines yourself. And so what you can do is you can connect those machines up to Azure and then say, hey, Azure, I want these machines to become a Service Fabric cluster. Azure pulls the bits down, deploys them, sets it up, and now you have a cluster.
Yes.
Manages upgrades and things like that.
And that way you have this sort of single, you can go to the Azure portal and you be able to see service fabric clusters deployed in Azure and service fabric clusters deployed on premise.
Yeah, elsewhere.
And you can do the same thing around that. So that might be something that is interesting to you in terms of how you have this, multi-view of where your clusters are.
Yeah.
I mean, the idea then is that if you build applications and deploy them on premise and in Azure, the applications remain the same.
Yeah, they work the same either way. I mean, so your question though was, yeah, I mean, technically you could have a cluster on-prem that spans up into Azure or would burst up to Azure.
Yeah.
In practice, that sort of topology is really hard because you need to scale up the machines in Azure. At that point, you're basically talking about an on-prem cluster that's standalone that is using IaaS machines in Azure as that bursty capacity. I've seen a couple customers create things like this, but in practice, they're, unless you plan to burst quite often, they're complicated to set up and manage. And therefore, we haven't seen too much use of them. Typically, what you end up with is separate environments, a cluster on-prem, and then if you need the extra capacity, you spin up a cluster in Azure kind of on demand and deploy additional copies of your stuff there. And then when you're done, you scale it all down and shut it down. Maybe you take some backups and then restore them into your on-prem cluster so that you have a consistent thing to deploy from. But that's more common. Technically it's possible, it just isn't very commonly done.
Yeah, and there is some complexities there, about where you have the majority of your cluster machines.
Well, I mean, there's multi-site and quorum type issues where you want to make sure that no quorums get torn across the sites. You also just have a management problem where, right, so you have one version of the operating system on-prem, and then you have a slightly different version of the operating system in Azure. Setting up and managing the OS images might be a little bit different. Exactly which version of pre-built software you get can change a little bit. So again, it's doable, but not too many people actually do it.
Cluster on premise, cluster in Azure.
Yep, tends to work. And then you kind of scale them up and down independently as you need.
Yes.
That's good. Speaking of dependencies, Whit wants to know how will Mesh handle dependencies like .NET 4.7 or Node.js? Will everything simply be required to deploy in containers?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
The answer is yes.
I mean, effectively, yes. The way I think about Mesh is this, is that we've actually provided a first-class concept for an application consisting of a set of services. If you think about microservices design, where you have a collection of services that you want to deploy, and you've now turned this into first-class ARM resource type, which you can deploy inside your Azure environment, and you can hook it up to other resources as well. And then effectively, in the world where you want to make sure that everything is self-contained and isolated, everything is deployed and run inside containers. They're actually Hyper-V containers inside.
Yeah. So they're carrying all their dependencies with them. I mean, it's kind of what you do today with if you wanted to say carry around .NET Core with your .NET Core .NET app. It looks a lot like that. It's just wrapped in a container. That's the primary way that we expect people to manage their dependencies like that. So each service would be in its own container, and each container would carry along only the dependencies that service needed.
Yeah, so effectively, yes, you build it all into containers, you push it all. And then another interesting, then exactly, you push them all into ACR and then do it from ACR, you build them.
Yeah, the ACR build stuff I think looked pretty good in terms of helping to automate cluster creation or container creation.
Yeah.
I think that ACR plus Mesh is going to be a pretty cool combination where you go from like VSTS to ACR build and then deploy into Mesh.
Because the build happens in ACR.
Right.
Yeah.
So now I don't have to have all this stuff on my machine.
Yeah.
I just have my local code, my .NET app or my Python Flask app or whatever.
Yeah.
And then when I get it gets through VSTS, so all the builds and tests look good, goes into ACR build, and I get a container image, and then I take that container image and push it into that.
Exactly.
I think that's going to be a pretty sweet
And
scenario.
if you watch the video we did as well, we've been working very closely with the Visual Studio guys for having a first-class developer experience for Service Fabric Mesh on your local machine. And the container debugging experience there is incredibly fast. It's actually pretty cool what they're going to do, so that it doesn't look like you're sitting there ages for the container to start and get provisioned and things. So that's something that will also come as public preview. That's a few weeks away.
I think the
Where are we at?
next question here is actually from Mahmoud, scrolling down all of Marcin's.
Well, Marcin said one thing first that I want to touch on, which was the notion that the collections are going to be able to run on top of Service Fabric and outside of Service Fabric. I mean, at a minimum, that really helps with unit testing and things like that. So we're really happy that we're able to do that, where you still get the transactional aspects of the collections, but you don't have to run a cluster and deal with the replication, and you don't even have to have the SDK really installed. Everything is coming in through that NuGet package. Naturally, the collections will work better in an actual environment because they'll be replicated.
Because you get HA. Yeah.
Because you actually get HA for them. But
okay.
in terms of unit testing things, single box testing, testing in disconnected environments or places where you couldn't install the SDK, all that stuff, we think that actually is a big deal. It's going to make development a little bit simpler and easier.
Cool.
So fair point.
Yep.
Now, you guys said an actual question somewhere.
Well, let's see.
Marcin, I think your question was an actual question. I'm not going to.
Right. No, it was
Marcin's also trying to spin up a 7-region cluster.
I wish him luck.
Yes.
Like France Central works.
France Central's been having some issues.
He says it's down again, actually, later on.
Yeah.
So.
Yes,
Okay.
okay. Okay.
No.
The region.
On-prem scenario a little further. This was Mahmoud.
Yeah, stretching the on-prem SF scenario a little further. What about migration path for apps running on-prem SF cluster to mesh? So can I take my apps from on-prem and seamless move them to SF mesh? That depends on how you're running them on-prem. If you're running them in containers already, then and you're using the resource model.
Yeah.
That's
So
Yeah,
I mean the
you could also
goal.
package them into containers.
Right. I mean, if you're using so let's fast forward 3 to 4 weeks till you get a local development experience for mesh or for a mesh style environment. Let's say that you took your existing Service Fabric application, removed the existing dependencies, packaged them into containers, added all the dependencies back at NuGet packages, described the application in the resource model rather than the XML application model today. If you do all that, that application will run exactly the same on Service Fabric on-prem as it will up in mesh. But implicitly, a bunch of things had to happen in order for you to do that, right? It had to be containerized. It couldn't be using some of the prior SDK stuff because, again, that SDK stuff might have node or cluster specific things that you can't do in the mesh environment. So the new dependencies strip all that stuff out, things like that. So it is going to be possible to have applications that run on-prem and in mesh, exactly the same definition, exactly the same code, but it's likely that to get from what you have today to that application, you'll have to make some changes. Whether they're deployment type or modeling type changes, like representing it in the resource model or building them in containers or something like that, those are the steps that you'll have to do in order to get them to be able to transfer between things. And we don't have a first-class list of all the things that you'll have to change just yet. We can kind of list them off our head, but it is intended that we want to make that as easy as possible so you can convert your existing stuff to the resource-based model and to these other kind of dependency model, and then maybe lift that whole thing up into mesh.
Yeah, and that's probably something when we release mesh that we'll have to give guidance on.
Yeah, absolutely. Here are the things that you would have to change. I have an I have this thing. Yeah, ideally a lot of it's going to be built into tools. We'll see how much we get.
Yeah.
But ideally, we'll have at least a conversion guide where you go, I've got this thing today.
Yeah.
I want to convert it into an environment or into a form where it can run on-prem or in mesh. Here are the steps, right?
Yeah.
And there'll be tools, I'm sure there will be. And that's what I'm saying, it's a multi-month journey at the moment.
Yeah.
We've just started, but it's a great direction.
Let's see.
Can you explain why using default services construct in an app manifest could create issues with production deployment? There's an MS blog article on this, but it doesn't describe any real pitfalls or knowledge deficiencies. So basically, it's a question about default services. Are they a convenient way of deploying my services, but should I really use them?
I think I know which blog you're talking about. It's one written by Larry Wall, who's a premier developer, Microsoft consultant kind of guy. I actually thought that article, it did an okay job describing some of the problems that you can run into, but it basically comes down to the fact that services in Service Fabric are really imperative constructs. Something is calling an API like create service async or new service, and you can run into some weird situations where you have a declarative form that is really just driving some imperative APIs. In particular, you can get into situations where, let's take an example of an upgrade. So you do an upgrade of your application, and it gets all the way through, almost all the way through, and then rolls back. So depending upon what that change was and when and where exactly it rolled back and why, you might see those changes that you made to your default services stick, or you might not see them stick. Your services, if you add or remove services in the default services section, you can also get some interesting results where your changes either did or didn't apply. And that's because at some point, the system has to decide when to call the imperative API, right? Does it do it at the beginning of the upgrade? Does it do it at the end of the upgrade? How does it know if those changes actually took effect? So if you call something like update the service and you change the placement constraints, which is something you can do, maybe your service can't be placed. Maybe some of the services can be placed, but not all of them. Is that supposed to be, was that intentional? Should that upgrade succeed or fail? How does it know whether or not to put the constraints back? If it puts them back, does it have to undo the rest of the entire upgrade? All that kind of stuff. And that's, again, because you're really mixing the declarative thing of the upgrade changing the type and the imperative thing of manipulations, ops, things that you want to do to the services. So the way the default services are today, it just mixes these things, and that makes it very unclear about how some of these situations should be handled. So you can absolutely go with purely default services and turn on enable default services upgrade and go that way. But you're going to maybe be surprised by a few of these things that happen. The happy path works great, but sometimes if you get into some of these failure cases, you'll see some weird results and it won't entirely make sense to you. So that's one of those things that I think that blog post tried to talk about how mixing these models isn't really the best and can create some of these confusing situations. So I hope that makes some sense. There's also a document that we have that talks about enabling default service upgrade. That talks about some of the pros and cons and things you have to watch for as well. So I would say read that also and see if that helps out. I'm glad it helps out. Again, it's one of those things that we also tried to fix in Mesh where there is no imperative thing. You only have the declarative model, and that way you can't accidentally step on your own toes. Actually, a great example is just to make it very concrete for people, we had an internal team the other day who was deploying things via default services and everything was working great. And then in order to solve a live site issue, they went in and changed some things about their service, so they gave it more replicas. And then a little bit later, they did an upgrade. So they got their application, they got a new version of their application, and they did an upgrade. And the number of replicas shrunk. It went back to a lower number, and their incident showed back up. Because the number that they had in their manifest in that default service was the smaller number, and they'd imperatively changed it in production in order to get out of the live site thing. So that's an example of how mixing the models, you can end up with some weird results or some surprising things. It's always doing what you told it to do, it's trying, but you can be surprised when things don't match. And those are the types of things that we've tried to avoid again with Mesh, where everything is declarative and you can see everything front and center. So I hope that helps a little bit.
Okay.
All right. I don't recall reliable access being mentioned in a roadmap presentation. Will it be included in Service Fabric Mesh and or on-prem containers? So you can take Service Fabric access and you can take our reliable collections and you can actually put them inside containers and deploy and run them today. We're trying to improve that experience. It's about 5 or 6 steps you have to do at the moment to kind of get them in there, but that is possible. However, for all the reasons that we sort of just slightly mentioned earlier on in terms of the tight coupling between reliable services today and the underlying cluster itself, running those containers in Service Fabric Mesh isn't something that we're focused on right now. We're going to look about what we can do. We're not ruling it out entirely, but we know that we're going to have to get through some complexities there because we can't afford you to hold up a node upgrade or an application upgrade.
Yeah, a lot of it comes down to the same reasons that we're separating out the APIs into their own packages and letting you carry them all together, and the same reason that we have to figure out how to do certain API calls in a multi-tenant way that we don't do today. So like, there's nothing really about the actors or the collections that's wrong, except that they're bound to the lifecycle of the cluster, so that's bad if the environment is shared, which mesh is shared. They require direct access and expect to be able to see everything in the cluster, which is fine, except that in mesh you can't see the whole cluster, right? And they expect to have access to all the system services directly, and you don't.
Yes. So that's all. And so we just have to kind of work our way through that thing.
Yeah.
And but at the same time, we'd encourage you to kind of use multiple other. There are other choices of frameworks as well that you pick up and use and things like this.
Yeah. So I mean, I think it's TBD exactly how much they move. The reliable services model is a little bit easier to move because the main thing that you were getting was the lifecycle stuff, which we can do without deriving from some specific class, and the collections, which we can provide you with that NuGet package. The actor model is a little bit harder because it's inherently a heavier framework and it is more coupled to the runtime. So that's one that's going to take a little bit longer to figure out. Remoting on its own is another example of something that is expected to work eventually, but that today requires full access to the cluster, and we have to figure out how to remove that. And for reliable services, that remoting isn't such a big deal because you have other transports available, but actors are coupled to remoting, so that adds another thing where the actors are going to be a little bit trickier to move. Again, it's something that we want to figure out how to move. It's just not something that's going to work on day one in all likelihood.
Okay.
This is a good question about GMSAs.
We tested GMSA accounts for an on-prem cluster to run under the context. So this is where you can take a particular service and you can run it under an AD account, a GSMA account, because you have Active Directory installed on premise. We found that we had to add the servers, the actual machines, at the root level of the AD tree with the ability to see all of their subdirectories inside that. You can't find any documentation that describes what was required around permission structures for this. The problem manifests itself when you try to run a Microsoft Service Fabric service underneath an AD account. I don't know the answer to this one.
No, I haven't seen anything, and it feels more like a requirement of GMSAs themselves than Service Fabric.
That's what I think as well.
Really, all you're doing is, GMSAs are really a Active Directory Windows Server concept. So if these are requirements, that's where they're coming from. From Service Fabric's perspective, all we're doing at the end of the day is run as. It's the same Windows command that's existed forever, and running them in the context of that local group that then Active Directory and server are managing.
I guess I just would ask, is it causing you a problem? Is it just because you're having to give them more privileged access to the root than you expect? I'm just trying to understand the actual issue that's happened here.
Yeah, but it feels like it's something that's going to be GMSA or Active Directory specific. I haven't heard this much.
It seemed like it has.
It's a good thing to clarify in our docs.
Without as well.
What does it say there?
We tried this without GMSA restoration. The issue is more on the microservice using AD. Oh.
But what's the actual problem that you end up having? Just that you have to add it to a particular part of the AD tree or forest? Or?
Do you have a microphone, Mark? Maybe you could talk to us.
I think this is because you're getting the service to run underneath it.
Hi guys.
Hey.
So effectively what happened is if you push a microservice into our on-prem cluster and we use an AD account to for the permission side of things, there seems to be an issue with communication with AD at that point in time. So we found that because we're using network service as the root account as well in the instance where GMSA is not in use, we had to put the computer as an account at the root level of the AD forest so it can see the complete forest. So it's more of a case of what parts of the forest does it actually look at and examine to get information, so that we don't have to have it at the root if that is still the case that we have to do that.
I haven't heard of this particular thing happening. I agree that seems like too much permission, but I'm not sure where that requirement is coming from. Maybe this is a good in-depth GitHub issue that we can open up and you can share with us how you've configured GMSA and AD, and then when you said there's like communication issues between the services or whatever, we can figure out what that is, what that failure looks like, and diagnose it from there. I haven't heard of other people, either nobody else thinks that this is a problem, or nobody else has run into this. This is the first time I've heard of having to put things at the root. So something it's either expected and everyone else is just fine with it, but I agree that it sounds at least a little weird, so we can look into it.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you've got some services running under this account, you've got the other services running in a network account.
Mm-hmm.
The network account's a machine account, you have to put the machine in it's same scope to be able to see them all.
Just to be able to communicate with each other or something like this. So let's dig into it and open up an issue for it.
So generally, our use case is that we use AD accounts so that we don't have to have passwords floating around anywhere, so that we can use other infrastructural elements like data sources and so forth using Kerberos security. And so obviously we want to maintain that when we push our applications into ASF on-prem as we do currently.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense, and that's exactly why we have the GMSA support for on-prem. But it does sound like something might be able to be improved. So we should look at what those errors actually are, and we should look at the configuration that you've got, and we can kind of take it from there. But this might end up being an AD GMSA thing rather than us, but we can figure it out.
But it sounds like you're mostly concerned within the scope of what you can see inside.
Well, he's saying that you have to make it see everything, which seems excessive.
Yeah.
So we can figure that out.
So launch a GitHub issue, I think is the here that you should.
Do you know where the GitHub issue is?
Links.
Microsoft.
Yep, I think I might have pushed something there prior which wasn't answered, but I'll point you guys to that. Thank you very much.
Oh yeah, okay. Well,
perfect. We'll try again.
So describe your scenario. Yes, make sure that when you put inside there, you say, I created a service that runs under this account. I created I had services running in a network account, and if you could post, and I wouldn't, and if you then say I wouldn't expect to see, the scope of having to put the machine into the root of the Active Directory in order for these services to communicate, and then basically if you can say post a screenshot of what that looks like, it really helps. Describe it through the scenario you're having and then the thing that you want to get fixed. Just do it that way, because sometimes we get some of those posted, we're not too sure what people are actually asking. So just give us this scenario.
Cool. Good. So Marcine's making progress.
Next question by Marcine is, can you say something about blacklisting mechanisms? Sometimes services are blacklisted on some nodes when they're failing a lot. Is it documented? So we don't have a way today to, I think the issue you're asking on is if a service is failing a lot, Service Fabric will try to restart the service on different nodes. This can cause issues if you have a faulty service. We don't have anything for this today, but coming up, we are gonna introduce a feature which will allow you to configure or tell the hosting in Service Fabric how often you want to try, how often you want it to retry bringing your service up. So today we don't have anything for this on this map. Correctly.
I think there is Blacklisting that we've had that did the backup retry mechanism.
Yeah, there's two things that are interacting here. One is the hosting has two configs, and I'll look them up and put them in the config. When your service fails, there's a back off time where we say, okay, the process exploded. We're going to wait a second before trying to create the process again. And then there's also kind of an activation time where after we activate the process, especially if we've been doing it a lot, we try not to spam the thing, creating a whole bunch of services. So those two things can interact. But what does happen is that if we go to create a service on a node and every single time we go to create it, it fails, we eventually do this thing called blacklisting the nodes, which is a link that I've pasted you. And what that is we say, there's something up with trying to create this service on this machine. We've tried a bunch of times, it keeps not working, so we're going to stop. And that goes into like a queue where it stays blocked for a while, and then invariably we let that expire, and then we can try on the node again. Yeah, so the blocklist does expire, and it comes back later. But what can happen is if it just fails a bunch more times, it gets blocklisted again. So typically if your app is like crashing real hard on service creation, you almost never observe the retries. The block listing time I don't believe is exponential. I think it's a flat amount of time, but I'd have to go look it up. We haven't touched it in a while. The back off time at the hosting layer for the process activation, that one is exponential up to some maximum. So what can happen is that the node isn't block listed anymore, but the process hosting at the actual node knows that I'm not allowed to activate this type yet. So it just sits there. So what you typically end up seeing is that you create a service that's failing. It fails on all the nodes really fast. They all have backed off on their process creation. They have all reported up that they are blocked. And then the blocks expire, and they eventually try again on the actual machines. But if you fail again, it just immediately gets blocked again because you're still at that exponential limit for concurrent failures.
But just to add on to that, the thing that we are really seeing support for is for you to give us a config that says only try, like, if it fails on node X, only retry it on 1/3 of the nodes, or
Right.
1/4 of the nodes, or 1/5 of the nodes. If you don't want to spam that process creation on all the nodes.
Right.
I just need to know if I wait, for example, an hour, can I be sure that if I have fixed the underlying issue, for example, redeployed the missing certificate, because this is one of the most common issues, is it going to be fixed?
Yes.
So is 1 hour save time, or for example, half an hour is save time? How much is safe?
I'll find the time, but it will fix itself.
Yeah,
And then
it's useful to know the actual time.
Yes, I am looking. I don't remember off the top of my head, but it will fix itself.
Mark looks surprised.
I'm not surprised you did not tell me yet.
Oh, come on, man.
It will fix, I know, but you really want to know the time it fixes itself, otherwise it could be like 5 days.
It's not that long.
I know it's not that long.
If it were that long, nobody would ever run services past beta because they would all fail and never come back.
Yeah, but the certificate one's a good point, because you deploy an application, you forget to put your certificate, it comes up, yes, it fails to find the certificate, it fails, and then keeps retrying.
Yes.
Hopefully we fix the error message on 6.2 for that one, yes?
What?
There's a beautiful error message now if you don't have a certificate deployed with your application.
So that is fixed in 6.2?
It is really improved.
Yeah, it at least tells you kind of what the
what
the failure was. Yeah.
It's
Like
beautiful.
that.
Okay,
Did we?
are we getting to the end?
No, we're not. I
One
think
more question.
WIT. Did we do this one from WIT? Is it possible to deploy everything with the default services, then remove them from the picture and run exclusively declarative from there without redeploying everything? Is what he's thinking is, I'm thinking just exclude them from the app manifest or similar and just deploy an update of that and go through there.
It is tricky. It is doable, but it's very tricky because one of two things will happen. It'll complain that you removed the default services, but that there are still services running in the cluster. Or if you accidentally already have on enable default services upgrade and remove the default services, it will delete all your services because that's what you told it to do. So you have to do a very specific dance. I would say if you are interested in that dance, you can open an issue and we'll try and get the procedure down. I know we've done it for a few people, but what I would try to do is, I like default services for my local dev box experience and kind of like getting things running and debugging stuff. But when I try to put things in production, I try to settle on whether or not I'm going to go only default services or only imperative. And after that, I try to recommend people not to touch things.
So just from my own knowledge on this, would you have to kick off a new application upgrade with the new manifest that you give it?
Yeah.
And then when you remove the default services, if you had the
Enable
config-
default service upgrade enabled, it deletes them because that's what it says. It says there's no more default services.
I see.
So it would delete them.
Okay.
So you would have to make sure that flag is off
Gotcha.
and then remove the default services.
Okay.
So sometimes that flag gets turned on during development because I'm changing things
Yeah.
about the target replica set size or placement constraints or things like that, and I want that to work, or I'm adding new services and I want that to work. So I have enable default service upgrade enabled. Then I go, yeah, I'm done with these, it's all good, and I delete them, and then it drops everything in your cluster because that's what you said to do. So again, it's mixing these models, and that's when things get a little weird.
All right, let's see where we are now. Progress from Marcin, 7 nodes and 7 regions.
There you go, you did it.
You did it. I think, let's see, we're coming up towards the end. We got about 6 minutes left, so
All right.
whatever questions you have.
Take a breather.
Yeah, we'll take a little breather, but make sure you get your questions in the chat window.
There we go. What is typical recommended process for removing default services? During CI build, agreed it's convenient in local testing, but I can't even count how many times I left the default services in by mistake. What is the recommended process for removing default services? I think this is open a GitHub issue, and then
Yeah, we'll get you the
Yes.
specific list, but it's basically make sure enable default service upgrade is false, so that when you remove them, it doesn't delete them, and then do another upgrade of the application.
Sorry,
to delete them.
let me clarify. They're not actually in use in an environment. Basically, in, let's say, production, default services are not enabled. I was just asking for clarification. In local testing, it's nice to have them on, and then obviously when you get your build out, you want to remove them from the app manifest so that it doesn't go in. So oftentimes I forget to do that, and then my build or my registration or upgrade blows up because
You're trying to create a service that already exists. Or test something
yeah, exactly. So would like to have to not remember to remove them every time I do a deployment. So I was wondering if CI was a typical place that people do it, or am I doing something?
Usually by that point, when you're doing VSTS builds, it's a separate manifest that you've created that is not the manifest that you use for local testing. So the local environment is running off of some branch, and then when you push into the actual production build, that's got a different manifest that doesn't even have default services in them, and that way you don't have to go do like an XML rewrite in order to strip that section out. I have seen people do that as a part of their build process, but you can just skip that step and have a separate manifest, that the production one, that doesn't even have that section in there. That's more common.
Can you expand on that a little bit? I mean, how do you have a different manifest?
Well, so the manifest, it's just like any other change in like Git, right? The manifest that I have locally is not the manifest that I'm pushing as a change into the main branch that builds. So when I push into that branch, my local manifest that has the default stuff in it stays local, and I don't push that manifest into the actual branch that's going to get built. Now, that also gets complicated the more that you have in the manifest. So if you have new application parameters or things like that, you need to figure out what changes you want to merge. So you'd merge maybe the application parameters and changes related to new service manifest imports, but you wouldn't merge the default services manifest or part of the manifest. Another thing that you can do, which is actually what I prefer doing, is there's a way, even for local development, to not use default services and still get a good F5 experience. It does require more work. But there's basically a flag you can flip, and I can look that one up, which tells Visual Studio not to touch your manifest, so your manifest changes become manual. That's usually okay once you've got the set of services that you're pretty comfortable working with and you're just updating code. So that you don't have to worry about if I added a new service, I forgot to add this service manifest import, whatever. So then you can take the default services out and nothing will put them back in, which is nice. And then there's inside your application package in VS, there's a scripts folder. Inside scripts, you can create a script called start-service.ps1. And inside there, you basically run the imperative APIs to create the services. So that's where all your new services would be. And this helps keep your local debug experience, simple and working, but gets the default services out of there so that you don't have to deal with this merge. Most people I see just deal with the merge. So they merge up only the changes that they want to take into the application manifest, like version changes or new service imports or things like that, and then delete or don't merge up any changes to the default services section. So that's another way to do it.
Okay, cool.
Okay.
Oof, just in the nick of time, we have a minute left. You don't have any surveys or anything?
Oh, what?
No.
No surveys.
Oh, surveys.
No, we're not having surveys.
I heard service. And her like, he does lots of service.
All right.
Marcine's cluster is up.
Yes,
Cool.
it is.
Good luck with that. Your outbound costs are going to be very interesting, especially if you start replicating large stuff. But thank you for helping pay my salary. I appreciate it. But that should work. Yeah, I mean, that's exactly it. That's exactly how we expect it to work. You might see some other things, Marcine, if you try to go like higher durability tiers. I don't know that that will actually work particularly well right now. We might have to do some funny stuff where we create multiple node types, but that's the idea.
Thanks, Hal.
Thanks, Hal, and thanks everybody else, I think, for calling in.
Thanks, guys.
We appreciate it.
Yeah, yeah, thanks. We'll
Yeah.
see you next month.
And here's to another 24.
Absolutely. How about that?
Yeah.
Cheers.
Thanks, everybody.